welcome to another episode of the Endurance Podcast with myself, Alex Rhodes, and my glamorous assistant, Tim Podlogar. Nice to get a smile on your face there, Tim.
Yeah, Alex.
How are you doing?
Actually pretty good. Like tomorrow I'm traveling back to Slovenia and then to Livenia. So looking forward to do some cycling outdoors finally.
Nice. And I suppose it'll be pretty hot there at this time of year.
I don't know. I come from the UK, and I didn't really have time to look at the weather forecast, so I have no idea.
I think we need to start doing just a special weather edition at the start of this podcast now, because it's becoming a bit too common. But I suppose at the time of this recording as well, we've just finished the Tour de France, which I know you did some work at, and also we've got the Olympics starting as well, which is another fascinating event with the different types of physiology that go into track and field sports and things like that. So I guess first of all, what was your take on the Tour?
Well, I don't know, predictable in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was exciting to watch, although I was not really happy how everything turned out somewhere in the middle of the Tour. But yeah, let's not go into the details.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a moment, I guess, in the first week where we weren't quite sure what was going to happen. And there was all kinds of, I don't know, leaders over that time. And then as it slowly progressed, it became a bit like, yeah, we know, we kind of see the story playing out now. So I suppose it was exciting to start, and certainly from my perspective as well. But as it went on, it was a bit like, okay, yeah, we kind of know. We know what's going on now, but it was still good nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely one of the better ones, I think. And can't wait for the next year's edition because, well, Jonas will probably try to get back on track.
Yeah. I mean, he did amazingly well to say where he's come from. So yeah, it would certainly be interesting. And Evenepoel as well, the first Tour, he was up there, which kind of shows a good thing going forwards for next year as well. So hopefully it'll just be a little bit more close up the front. But going on to the Olympics now, because you have a history in sailing, of course. Like, what sport do you like? Do you watch the Olympics?
I don't watch anything. I watch cycling, but that's because I need to watch pretty much. But otherwise, I don't follow sports whatsoever. I had no idea about the football Europeans. Like, I don't know anything.
You don't even get
sports.
invested in the 100-meter sprint. Like, that's nearly everyone's like go to.
No idea.
No. Okay. Oh, the sailing. That's where I was going.
No, not even. Like, I have no idea who represents Slovenia. Pretty much, like, I'm just not involved in anything anymore.
Well, the cycling has certainly changed for Slovenia, hasn't it? Because Poggy's out now.
Yeah, I kind of know what's going on there just because I have to know.
I think we all know what's happening there. He's not that tired. So yeah, like we've got it's been an exciting summer of sport anyway. But I suppose moving on with the conversation, we've got a super exciting guest with us today, a good friend of mine. We know each other through racing the early days of Exeter. She's a pro triathlete. She's currently ranked 15th in the Ironman Pro Series with numerous top fives. It was second at Ironman Texas. And also, I suppose, going back in the days, Asia Pacific Xterra champion. So it's with warm welcome, Penny Slater.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Yeah, that Xterra days seem like a long time behind me now, but yeah, I forgot about that one.
Well, they do, and I think that I suppose that's where we go back and racing Xterra. That's kind of how we met through having the same coach and being at the same races. And it seems so long ago, the days of, there was Maui, there was Germany, there was Czech, probably Australia somewhere in the way. So, there's, but from my perspective as well, it's just a fascinating journey to see and know you over those years. And I know things changed around COVID time, but watch you go through, the Xterra, and now you've transitioned over to Ironman, a long distance triathlon, and just seem to be excelling every year and every race that you get on. And I know it probably doesn't feel like that as an athlete, but looking from the outside, it's inspiring, and so nice to see a friend doing that. So I suppose just for the listeners, really, like, tell us a bit about your background, like how did you get into triathlon, and then obviously we can talk about the transition through Xterra to Ironman.
Yeah, for sure. So growing up, I wasn't involved really with anything related to triathlon. I played field hockey for 10 years, all the way up until I was 18. And then I also did equestrian too for all of my childhood. And then once I finished school, just as an off-season thing for hockey, we did a novice triathlon program. And then, so I got into it from there, didn't take it seriously at all. But then I guess through that, I made some mates who rode mountain bikes and stuff. And so then I got into mountain biking and really enjoyed that. And then that's kind of how I got into Xterra. And so sort of 2 years after starting triathlon, so that was back in 2014, I pretty much just changed and started doing only off-road triathlon or all the Xterra stuff. Yeah.
And I mean, was that, we know where the conversation's going now, but, did you think that I'm just going to continue my life doing Xterra, because it's very different to the road, and we both know that, the disciplines, the terrain, and everything else like that is just dramatically different to being on the road. So, at that time, did you think that, this is it, I love this sport, and there wasn't going to be anything else?
Yeah, I think so, a little bit. I mean, and I, back then I was a bit younger and a bit braver. So I loved mountain biking. I loved sending it on all the trails, and, and this, Alex, the places you got to go with Xterra are so amazing. I love being out in nature, and I guess you get that on the road, but not quite as much, you're always exploring new trails and stuff when you're mountain biking and trail running. So yeah, I guess because I fell into the Xterra side of things, and then I got on the Asia Pacific tour, and then started racing in Europe a little bit. I kind of started knowing more people, and then so I just stayed in that. And yeah, I didn't even really know what long course triathlon was at that point in time, to be honest, because I was so new to triathlon. I didn't really know anything about anything.
And, go on, carry on.
No, you're right.
I was going to say, and there's kind of a turning point, or certainly from my perspective, but maybe, you can talk about it, because you then, you saw that you started touring around, you came to Europe and Asia Pacific, but then you went and won Asia Pacific champs, which I remember at the time. I don't know if you found that was a bit of a surprise in your performance, or whether you just slowly felt like you were edging towards it and that it was achievable. How did that play out? And was it a turning point in your triathlon career, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really funny one. I do feel like for a lot of people, it came out of nowhere. It was kind of just actually a representation of how I'd been training, I think, properly. And when you're a young athlete, lots of the time you want to train really hard. And I think I was training really, I was just going way too hard in all my sessions. And then I was racing well below my potential, I think, in a lot of the races that I did. And I didn't know how to pace myself. I didn't know, I would just go threshold the whole time until I blew up, basically. But yeah, I mean, the start of that year, I was training a lot with my coach then, Jackie Allen, who's also a professional Xterra athlete. so we had like a really good build into both Xterra Taiwan and then Xterra Rotorua was the weekend after that. So yeah, I think she won nationals 3 weeks before Taiwan and beat me like with a K to go. I beat her in Taiwan, and then she did the same thing in New Zealand and kicked with a K to go and beat me again. So that was a really cool 3 months of racing for me. But we'll probably get into this a bit later. But after that, it was actually a bit of a decline for me because at that point before Xterra Taiwan, I'd had quite a big focus on trying to cut weight so that I could climb better. And then I really, and I know this now looking back, like in terms of relative energy deficiency in sport, I was definitely in a hole there, and that was kind of my spike of 2 months of performing well. And then it was like, really was in a hole after that and was not performing or training well. So yeah, I mean, I look back on those memories fondly, but I also know that at that point in time was not really a sustainable thing for me.
Yeah, I mean, we're all learning, as we go through this walk of life, but those things, we have to be aware, and we will discuss it, that short periods may not have such an impact, but over the long term, and not only performance and general health, it can play a major role in that. So we really want to get into that topic of low energy availability in sport, and especially female sport. I think it's worth acknowledging that it does exist in both male and female sides, and I think originally it was more measurable, or there was some signs in female and not so much in male. But we really want to focus on the female side of it as well, because I think there's a lot of difficulties there, and a lot of things that happen from a physical, a psychological, and a behavioral aspect in professional sport. So before we go on to that, though, COVID happened, and that put a stop to all Xterra, really. We had to travel to do that. And was that a point in time where you decided, what was the turning point where you said, I'm going to go and try, or I'm going to go for long distance triathlon? Where did that change, and was it purely an interest thing? Was it a career thing as a professional triathlete? There's lots of factors that we don't see from the outside that influence these things.
Yeah, I mean, sort of midway through that 2019, when I wasn't really having, like, after I had those 3 really good races and then I wasn't really racing very well, we sort of decided that I was going to try a long course race at the end of the year, because we actually thought that my physiology was probably more suited to that. Just because it seemed that I was doing better in the races that were of longer duration as opposed to the shorter ones for Xterra, because we know that like the time you're out there can vary a lot depending on the course. And then also purely from like a financial perspective, like I loved Xterra, but viability of it being a long-term career choice, especially being from a Southern Hemisphere country, wasn't really going to be viable. And I knew that I loved triathlon and I loved the sport, so I wanted to try and make it, like, find a way to make it so I could actually make it my career. And so that's kind of what made us do a long course. So I did my first one at the end of 2019, and I was quite mediocre when I look back at the times and my power and stuff now. And then COVID hit, and it was that, was basically 2 years of my career erased. And at that point in time, I was just finishing up university. So I just finished university and then started teaching as a secondary high school teacher to sort of try and wait it out.
And now to the present day, you're absolutely killing it. Like, it just it's certainly through the public eyes, you just seem like you're going from strength to strength. What did you find the transition between the two? Because obviously they're very different. And if for the listeners out there, we've got Xterra, which is off-road triathlon, which can last between what, 2, 3, 3.5 hours of variable terrain, variable intensity to some steady state 8, 9, 10 hour race. So, you know, what difficulties, or, you know, what did you find in going through that transition? Was it a big learning curve?
Yeah, I mean, number one is actually learning how to ride a time trial bike and getting into it. Yeah. Not that bad. Not only learning how to ride a time trial bike, but also like learning how to get a good, like find a good position. Like some of my positions from back in the day are absolutely horrendous. I think then
you look at time trial bikes now though, and it's like a rocket ship. Like back in the day, we had like some pointy bars on the front and you know, for position. Now you're in just this rocket ship that is so smooth and so well positioned that it's just crazy how it's developed.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and also then another big thing was like learning how to fuel properly during races, pretty much, because in hindsight, like in my Xterra days, I was not like I would have a couple of gels for a race, you know, and that was like a 3-hour race. So it was really, I had very limited knowledge on that. So yeah, I guess that's like when I started long course, I started, thinking a little bit more about that and,
And did you then really have to think about, because obviously training demands just got vast as well, and you know, was there a conscious decision there that, you know, in training more and, you know, coming out of that darker side where you were under fueling, how did you then approach going into that and knowing I'm racing and training much more now, but actually I perhaps focused on it different in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that I'd learnt my lesson from the year before, Alex, but I hadn't, unfortunately. I was still like, obviously my training volume increased a lot. I was, you know, I remember the first 4-week block where I did like, I think I averaged between 26 and 28 hours for the week for 4 weeks. And I was absolutely cooked, like not like I couldn't do anything else outside of training or whatever. And, you know, now that's like pretty normal if, like I do that year round. But, to be honest, I was still of that mentality that I needed to be a bit lighter to run faster. And so I was, you know, looking back now, I was not fueling appropriately at all. I was getting better in races, but I wasn't like around training and stuff. I was still not really doing it correctly, especially during sessions in training. And I was at that point, I was still working as well. So, and I was working as a PE teacher. So, you know, you're sort of walking 15,000 steps a day as well on top of that. So, and I mean, that would probably attest to why I had some pretty average results as well for the first 2 years of my long course career.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it is fascinating. That kind of leads us on to, you know, the work that you're doing and the conversation that we want to have around that. And, you know, you're doing, you've moved on to do a PhD, and I know that this topic is pretty close to your heart, not only through your own experiences, but pursuing it academically. So I suppose for the listeners, you know, what is it that you're actually looking at within your research?
Yeah, so relative energy efficiency in sport, or REDS, and we know that that's underpinned by low energy availability, which you've talked about, Alex, which is basically, you know, not eating enough to support your energy needs for like normal physiological functioning, as well as the energy you expend during exercise. So, I mean, just based on the research that's out there, we kind of know among coaches and athletes that not many of them know about REDS, or if they do know about it, they're not sure how to sort of implement that education into everyday practices, whether they're a coach or an athlete. And that's not to say that there isn't people out there that don't know it, but this is just sort of based on the literature that's available at the moment. In terms of triathlon, we know like that it's really become an extremely popular sport. We're getting closer to getting 50% female participation rate in most races, especially like long course. It's getting really popular. And to be honest, there's barely any literature on triathlon, especially long course triathlon, because obviously triathlon's in the Olympics, so a lot of the research is focused around that and on the physiology, how to do it, how to get an athlete to be the best they can, sort of thing. But what we know from Reds is that it doesn't matter how good you're training. If you're not fueling, then you're not going to perform well and you're not going to get better. So then I sort of saw this gap where, I had my own diagnosis of Reds and have spent a long number of years trying to recover from it. And then speaking to other female professional athletes and other coaches and lots of other athletes I've spoken to have had their same experiences with Reds, but potentially haven't had that actual diagnosis. They've displayed the symptoms of it. Or you mention it to them and they haven't even heard of it before. And, just being out in the triathlon community, you see sort of those symptoms all the time.
Yeah,
I don't know how many people I've spoken to with bone stress injuries. So
I know, and you bring up some fascinating points there that there isn't a lot of research on triathlon in specific, and often, or certainly my observations, and whether Tim is congruent on this. We see research sometimes within running, sometimes within cycling, which have again different demands, and whether that's primarily down to lab equipment and the whole setup of research. But equally, we know triathlon has enormous demands, especially long course. We've got different stimulus. We've got cycling, which is not really weight bearing, but we've also got running and the swimming side of things, which places very different demands to just a solo sport as well. So it's really fascinating that you're doing that and trying to understand what that looks like in there. But I was going to have a question there in a sense of what your perception is, and you're within the pro field and you get to speak to people and see people like you just said. And obviously there's a lot of influences here that can lead to this. We've got the physiological, aesthetic, we need to be this certain image, which especially for females, it can be very difficult world to be in. We've got psychological, that lighter is faster. We've also got behaviors on how we eat and what we perceive to be good food. Maybe Tim can join in on this shortly from a performance perspective. That it fascinates me sometimes that you probably get this, that you get people and you're like, oh, I'm eating healthy today, and you're like, they've had a salad, and people perceive that as healthy, which, for the general public, it is healthy, it's quality, good quality food, etc. We're talking about enormous demands here, and we're having some lettuce. I'm exaggerating there, but you know what I mean? And that is not going to provide you enough energy. So is that really healthy in this context? So what, is that really prominent in the pro field? Are people still being a bit, because it has been driven forwards in terms of body image and, we don't need to be like that to perform. Do you still see that in the pro field? Like our coaches, our athletes still really caught up on social media image and, racing light and things like that?
Yeah, I feel like I can't probably speak for the whole pro female field, but as an athlete that's recovered from Reds, I still feel that pressure today. So just from my perspective, I definitely think that leanness culture is there. Not as much anymore, but I've had a number of comments that are like, oh, you're quite big to be a triathlete, and I think, talking to other pro female athletes, unfortunately, I've had some conversations with them where coaches have told them that they need to lose X number of kilos in order for them to perform. And we kind of know that, like, in terms of psychology, if you say that to and I'm not saying this doesn't happen in male athletes, but more commonly, if you say that to a female athlete, that's probably going to lead to some really poor eating behaviors. Whereas sometimes in male athletes, we tend to not see that as much. They're able to sort of brush it off a little bit more. And I think the problem with that is, we know that sometimes there is a place for quote unquote weight loss or leaning down, but it should be done under the strict guidance of a nutritionist. And quite often there's these remarks thrown around that, oh, that person is a bit fat or needs to lose a bit of weight by coaches or other athletes. But, there's no knowledge around how to do that safely to ensure that you're still performing at a high level. And, and just in terms of injuries and stuff like that, I know a number of female athletes who, have had long periods of time where they haven't menstruated, and a number of female athletes, you see it all the time with bone stress injuries and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, and even in the amateur levels, you still see it quite often, and a lot, even I would argue even more so, because, they're potentially less informed on that kind of stuff. I think if it's your job and you know about it and you're trying to do these things like lose weight or whatever, you would hope that a lot of professionals know the risks of that now, and they have a team around them to help them with it. But yeah, I think that's the education piece is probably the most important thing around how to do it safely, or why you even may need to do it, because you probably don't is the answer. You just need to perform at the weight that you're at.
You're absolutely right.
And
that that education is just absolutely key. Even in the, I would say, senior population, but what is, some fascinating things that we do see and that we do hear as well is, amongst the younger generations, and not having any, this is probably more so on the coach's side of things, not having any education around it, to a sense that you hear stories, and I've heard stories about this, where you've had young swimmers who start from, 5, go through, and then they're going through puberty, and all of a sudden, they don't start getting their period, but they're too young to even know or talk about it. And then, that leads on just to continue for a long period of time in their life, which can have, quite dramatic health consequences. So, it does come down to education quite a lot. But moving on to, the health impacts and the training impacts, I suppose, Tim, you can jump in on this. And, what, if we are, there's not only under fueling, but this is not having enough energy for physiological function, how does that really impair our performance? Whether you want to look at this holistically or whether you want to look at it right, on race day, what impacts physiologically is that going to happen if we don't have enough?
Well, it's like triathlon in the first, when you start to think about it, you have multiple training sessions a day. So basically, you're always pretty much struggling to recover for the next session. And if you get the nutrition wrong in the period between 2 training sessions, the next training session is going to be can be a disaster already. And then you don't feel good, and then you don't recover for the next one, which is probably in 12 hours or something, or a short period of time. And then it's just a ball starts to roll, and then I think it just you really struggle to recover from under fueling, and it's just the performance in the training sessions is obviously really important, not just from the perspective of putting the training volume in, but also psychologically and mentally, because if you're underperforming in training, then probably oh, what's going on, what am I doing wrong, and then if there is an additional pressure to, okay, you need to lose weight, and you're trying to lose weight, and then you're eating a salad between training sessions, and just doesn't really work. So I think there is a big issue, because the body is really good at adapting to low energy availability in terms of shutting down what is not necessary for that particular moment. And then it shuts down the things that in the long term would make you faster and better, which is also like, normal physiological functions. And then, you kind of sometimes don't lose weight because you're so underfueled. And you then cut even more calories. And it's kind of like, you can see this with professional cyclists all the time. Like the riders are not like eating enough and the weight just doesn't go down. But then as soon as you increase the amount of food they have, especially carbohydrates, the weight starts to go down because, well, this normal physiological function starts to come back on track. So probably like energy expenditure or the demands actually increase, but you can still be like in a very slight deficit if it's required. And I think like it's a really like tricky one, and in triathlon it can go really quickly wrong. I think more so than in perhaps running or cycling even.
And do you think that's because of the demand of doubling up sessions? Like, we know that runners, maybe not so much cyclists, but we know that runners may do double days. Certainly elite level cyclists probably just spend a lot more time on their bike, but not always double dayed. But then triathlon, it's like, a lot may swim every morning or most mornings, and then you've got a run or a bike session or both, in the afternoon. So, is that why it's more prevalent there?
I think it's also like, how do you quantify the energy demand? So like the training volume in just running is much lower than in cycling or triathlon because of the load on the bones and the tissues. So you don't see runners doing 20 plus hours a week probably, but you see cyclists and triathletes doing that. Whereas in cycling, you basically you can quantify every training session and say like, well, these are the energy demands for your training sessions because you have the power data from the power meter from the bike. And in running, you can't really use the power meter because they're not really reliable, even less so in swimming. So what do you do? Like, how do you go about calculating an energy demands in triathlon? You basically are guessing all the time. And this guesswork can really, like, if you organize your own nutrition yourself, you will probably end up underestimating the energy demand because, well, you are very aware of not trying to not gain weight, whatever that means. And I think like it can just lead to disaster then. And it's really difficult even from my perspective of a nutritionist to basically like say, okay, these are the demands of energy needs you need because you just can't quantify them.
And I think, we also, I mean, the training stimulus is going to be the most potent thing for performance at the end of the day. And, we need that energy, and part of that is to adapt as well. So if you're not fueling and you're not recovering, then you're also not adapting and needing that energy to make those adaptations as well. So like I say, it's pretty cyclic in the sense that everything will just start to go a little bit more downhill. But I suppose as well, like as athletes, we are humans, and life goes on outside of that, and life will continue after your time in sport. I mean, there's some fascinating people out there still doing sport in their 80s, but for high-level competitive sport, and there's some real implications there, and this is kind of moving on to the female athlete triad of, menstrual dysfunction, bone mass, and low energy availability, which, starts to impact that. And, Penny, maybe you can explain, how, if there are athletes out there that perhaps think, what are the signs really that we're going down this path? And you've obviously gone down that path and come out of that path. So there's no better person to ask there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the main first thing that I tell most athletes is like the first red flag if you're a female is if you lose menstruation. I mean, we know that it can occur because of a other variety of reasons like PCOS and stuff like that. But yeah, if you have your natural cycle, tracking that is really important to make sure that you're getting your period regularly. But sort of what we were talking about before, I think a really key sign, and this is something that I didn't realize until I was sort of out the other side of REDS, is that persistent fatigue day to day and that brain fog that you have when you are under fueling, like your ability to actually do stuff outside of training, work on a computer if you have a day job, do university, is really low and really limited. And so, that persistent feeling of fatigue and brain fog over periods of weeks, months, all really is a really clear indicator that something's not right and that you're most likely under fueling. And then flowing on from that, we obviously have the bone stress injuries that we know is, female athletes who have menstrual dysfunction are 4 to 5 times more likely to have a bone stress injury. And, if that calorie deficit is occurring over years and years, it can affect your bone mineral density, which is we obviously need to be able to load when we're running. And if our bone mineral density decreases, we have way more chance of getting bone stress injuries. And bone mineral density it's one of those things that's actually really hard to recover from and can take a number of years to recover from it, if at all. Like I know a lot of female athletes who had low energy availability for a long period of time as like junior athletes, and they're still dealing with issues into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and have never been able to recover their bone health from that. And they just have, I know a few who have had to give up the sport because they were just persistently getting bone stress injuries every time they started trying to load running. Sorry, that was quite long-winded.
That health consequence there, though, like you just said, is it's not just in the moment. It might not just be in the moment that I've got a bone stress and I need to stress fracture and I need to recover from that. But osteoporosis later on in life and just having that quality of life is not quite going to be the same, because you might not be able to be as physically active as you want, or even, I'm going well beyond this now, but even when you're older and the biggest thing in the elderly generation, slips, trips and falls, they're going to have a huge impact as a consequence of this. So, whilst we're all real focused on performance and everything else, we are humans at the end of the day, and we've got to look after ourselves to also be able to perform at our best. So I suppose, if you don't mind me asking then on that topic, is, how did you get out of it?
Yeah, well, I guess, I got into that long course after 2020 and 2021 was sort of the years that I started building back up to racing. And I did my first full Ironman in June of 2021. And I came 4th there, which was like pretty good for a first Ironman. And then after that, I started training again after I'd had a recovery period, and I got a stress reaction in my tibia. And the year before, I'd had a stress reaction in my one of my metatarsals, but it was kind of late diagnosis because of COVID, couldn't get into scans, et cetera, et cetera. So I never really thought anything of that metatarsal stress reaction. And then, so I was lucky. I got diagnosed with a stress reaction, and I got sent to one of the best sports doctors for female endurance athletes in Australia, who happens to be where I live in Canberra. And so, they sort of said, if you'd run any longer on this tibia, you would have snapped in half at your next race, pretty much. And I was lucky that the doctor I saw, she used to be a elite female cyclist, so had a lot of experience, like life experience as well, kind of with REDS. But she was very frank with me and said, based on your numbers, like your metabolic rate and the fact that you haven't had a natural menstrual cycle in a number of years, and like my sex hormones were super low as well, especially my estrogen she said, was very frank and said, you can continue down this path of underfueling, but I can guarantee you're going to be back here seeing me every 3 to 6 months if you are. And sounds like you want to have a really good career in triathlon. And so you need to get on top of this now and sort it out. And she said, go and see a psychologist, because we know like a lot of the problems around, underfueling is to do with the psychological component of actually physically feeling like you can't eat anymore because you want to be leaner. And then my coach at the time, Jackie, who she was also really good, and she said, no, well, you're going to have 6 weeks off because we need to get you in some form of energy balance before you can get back to training, because we know to recover from RED-S you need to reduce that. The easiest way to do that is to reduce the energy expenditure, because quite often, especially with triathlon, it's hard to eat enough to cover your energy expenditure when you're training. So yeah, I did that. So I had 6 weeks off, and then I just like built back really slowly and worked with a nutritionist, worked with a psychologist. And then, that took me well over a year to sort of get back to making sure I was eating enough day to day with training. And we were very cautious with load because to make sure that I was eating enough to do that. And I had all.
I was going to say, anyone following on Instagram will have seen you, running on the treadmill with, you had like the support as well, Yeah. I mean, we might laugh at that concept, but, that's kind of the way that it took you in having to try and protect yourself and get out of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the end, I had almost 4 months off running pretty much just because, we were, I was lucky that obviously it happened to me when I was a bit older, so it didn't compromise my bone health too much. But a big goal was to try and get my metabolic rate up so that I could so that I actually used energy properly. And lo and behold, I actually leaned up a fair bit once I started eating enough. And so then it's just been it's been a constant thing, to be honest, of and it can be tiring, making sure that you're eating enough every single day. And I still have periods where I look back and I'm like, shit, I did not eat enough for that 3-month block and 3-week block or whatever. And unfortunately, we know that with female athletes, we're super sensitive to that kind of stuff. And I'm especially very sensitive to periods of, only 3 to 4 weeks of maybe not eating enough. And perfect example is this one was a combination of factors, but at the start of the year, I had a training camp for 4 weeks and probably didn't feel appropriately during that training camp because I was just training a lot. And looking back now, I'm like, wow, you should know better than that. And, 3 months later, a combo of probably load, but also from that coming back to bite me, I got a stress reaction in my femur in April this year. So, it's one of those things that especially at the professional level, you have to be on top of all the time. You can't really have many days of being in an energy deficit, or if you are, you have to then try and get that back the next day.
Yeah. I suppose I've got a question for Tim on that as well. Is so for the listeners and they could be high performing athletes, they could be recreational athletes. What nutritional strategies do we need to think about? I mean, strip it back to basics. I know there's a lot of, it depends as part of this. But, what are the things that we really want to be thinking out, certainly to make that initial avoidance? Now, if training loads are enormously high, we're going to be somewhat competitive and focus a lot more on this. But, what can the general listeners think about and almost, to help some people avoid this situation, help performance increase, but also, that health perspective?
I think for long distance triathlon, one of the things that coaches very often believe is that you need to increase fat oxidation rates. And you kind of are asked as an athlete, to train for increasing fat oxidation rates. And how do you do that? Well, you restrict the carbohydrate intake in some way or another. This means either doing fasted training in the morning or just between two sessions, you restrict the carbohydrate intake. What this ends up being is restricting the energy intake, and this is basic energy deficit. And when you have like only 24 hours in a day and you need to remove the 8 hours when you're sleeping, you have only 16 hours of time when you're able to feed yourself, and then you're doing the training in the morning, you don't have a breakfast, and then you have a training which is, I don't know, 2 hours of no food whatsoever. You basically lost like 4 hours of not eating. So you basically, by the end of the day, you will never ever get back to the energy like balance, because, well, there is simply no time to ingest the amount of calories you need. So I think this kind of idea of like increasing fat oxidation rates is just like going to backfire at you, and like, oh, it's going to be a big issue for energy balance, from energy balance perspective. And there is, from my point of view, like no evidence whatsoever that you can actually increase fat oxidation rates by doing some sort of that kind of training, and that this is going to lead to performance gains in the end.
So you mean I can't just put olive oil in my drinks bottle and like that will meet my demands, and
have your shot of coffee before you ride, and that's it.
that coffee, olive oil in the bottle, I think we're all good.
Well, my view is it's not just like energy balance, it's also like where this energy is coming from. I think carbohydrates are the key here, and it's kind of insufficient carbohydrate intake, not necessarily insufficient energy intake. Like there is some data emerging that demonstrates it's carbohydrates that are most important when it comes to recovery and performance and avoiding RED-S.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, and that was going to be my next question. Actually, is do macronutrients matter in this from the perspective of, do we need to just meet a caloric intake, or are there influences of protein, fat, carbohydrates have that impact? And if so, then I suppose I best ask why.
Well, just the first, like the protein, like definitely the protein needs are increased in endurance athletes, but I wouldn't be too concerned if you like pay attention to like having decent amount of protein in the main meals, because the sheer amount of food the athletes are eating brings the protein intake in total like really high. So like at the Tour de France, the riders are eating like 3 grams per kilogram of body mass of protein, not because they eat the protein rich foods, it's just because they have a lot of food in overall. So I think from the perspective of nutrition planning, you just need to make sure that you have high quality protein at each main meal every few hours. And then when it comes to carbohydrates and fats, I think like from performance perspective, carbohydrates are the fuel for your workout. So if you don't replenish until the next training session, then the next training session will suffer, whereas fat is basically accessible in the body. So what you need to do from my point of view, like how I understand metabolism, is that, well, you need to supply the body with essential fatty acids and basically like support to the end of the day that you basically reach the energy, like match the energy intake with energy expenditure. But the carbohydrate intake is the most important, because having low liver glycogen means having low blood glucose levels. This then affects all the organs in the body, like for instance during the night. So there is like actually some evidence out there that like blood glucose levels in elite athletes can be dysregulated, and this could perhaps, like especially during the night, it could be that athletes are entering hypoglycemia, which could be a result of like insufficient liver glycogen. How do you sufficiently fuel the liver glycogen? Well, you need to eat carbohydrates, and sometimes even the forbidden, let's call them, sugars.
How dare you mention
fructose. But yeah, like I think like it's all about the carbohydrates. I think fat is important, but I think the most important are carbohydrates. So maximize the carbohydrate intake, and once you can't get enough carbohydrates intake in, then the fat is basically the the other nutrients that you basically add to get to the end the day in energy balance.
So, I mean, in general, then, people thinking about manipulating food strategies and think the overriding principle is that we need enough to support our training at the end of the day. Otherwise, we are not going to progress. And I guess that's the message. And, even for, I suppose, the more recreational athlete who, again, there's it depends on your job and may skip breakfast and things like that. Do we then just need to make sure as well that we're fueling during sessions? Because obviously that goes towards that daily intake, but also we're not digging big enough holes during that session as well, compromising recovery. How do we feel about that?
Well, I think you need to kind of it's a very individual approach to everyone. Everyone has their own way of life and ways how to deal with it. But in general, you can always do a faster training session. If you're training I don't know 15 hours a week, it's possible to do it without any negative consequences. But then you need to think about the day before and then during the session, what you do about it, and after the session to basically get back on track. But from scientific point of view, there is some evidence that carbohydrate restriction or energy restriction, whatever, can enhance adaptations when you're training up to 12 hours a week. But when you go above, there is absolutely no evidence this kind of approach will work, because pretty much every single training session you will end up with low glycogen anyway. So whatever you do before, and when you train multiple times a day, there is probably a high chance that at least 3 weekly sessions in the afternoon will be done in low glycogen availability state anyway, because there was simply no time to refuel properly. So these are all the things you need to think about. And I don't think nutrition, everyone needs to remember that nutrition is not the biggest stimulus. It's basically the training volume. So how do you optimize your training quality? That's the main goal. Once you basically are recovering super well for each training session, and you can start thinking about manipulating the nutrition, but very tiny bits. You're not ever going to become a pro athlete by just eating low carbohydrate diet and not training.
That is a great message to round up on for everyone.
Love it.
But I suppose it's been absolutely fascinating, story and conversation with you, Penny, and, commendable for recognizing, going through this, and then even pursuing it further to educate others. But what are the key take-home messages? And I know this will be applicable to the general public, but I know in female sport, these difficulties are much greater, and it's, worth acknowledging that a bit more, because I know people, it's pretty common. What are your kind of key messages, and whether this is, from your own experience, your education, physical, psychological, what are some of the messages that you could give to listeners to just help them if they perhaps experiencing some of this, or if they want to get better and progress their training?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my number one would be that lighter isn't always necessarily, or isn't generally faster. And if someone is telling you to lose weight, then don't be afraid to challenge them on that and say, well, why? How is that actually going to lead to me improving performance? Number two is fueling for performance, that the reason you're eating is so that you can perform well in sessions day to day, and then you will perform better because you've improved in every single session. So my advice would be to, just even if you're skeptical about it, try it for 3 weeks. You're not going to put on any weight. I highly doubt you will, and see how much better you feel in your day-to-day life and in your training. And that also being fit fitness is a feeling, and it's not how you look necessarily as well. So if you feel fit in yourself and you're performing well in training, then that's probably the only thing that matters.
I think those are pretty amazing messages, especially, you know, for younger athletes, but athletes in general, male or female, it's still applicable. So it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on. And, you know, we've not caught up in such a long time. So it's really great to once again chat. But thank you for sharing your story. Like, you know, it's one thing trying to educate and know about these things, but also getting that message from people who are and have been in the trenches and in elite sport where that really means something to them. So we can't thank you enough. And of course, we wish you absolutely all the best in Nice. That's coming up. We'll be cheering for you. So hopefully you can take that with you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. And thanks for joining us again, Tim.
Yeah, it was really an interesting discussion today. So I hope the listeners will enjoy it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, bye for now.